December 2nd, 1805, Napoleon Bonaparte faces the combined might of Europe. The Russian and Austrian empires unite to crush the French. Outnumbered, outgunned, and seemingly surrounded, Napoleon unleashes a masterpiece of strategy that will define his legend forever. In this episode of History in Under 15 Minutes, we dive into the story behind Austerlitz, Napoleon's greatest victory and perhaps the most brilliant battlefield maneuver in modern history. The road to Austerlitz. By 1805, Napoleon had already crowned himself Emperor of the French. But his reign was young and Europe was watching. Alarmed by his expanding influence, a new coalition was forming. The Third Coalition, made up of Britain, Russia, Austria, Sweden, and Naples. Britain, dominant at sea, financed the coalition while Russia and Austria prepared massive armies on land. Their goal was simple: destroy Napoleon and dismantle the revolutionary order he represented. Napoleon, never one to wait defensively, acted swiftly. From his staging ground at Boulogne, where he had once prepared to invade England, he led the Grande Armée on a lightning march eastward. His troops, renowned for speed and discipline, advanced into Germany before the Allies could fully mobilize. He executed a masterful campaign, cutting off the Austrians at Ulm and forcing the surrender of an entire army without firing a shot. This stunning victory opened the path to Vienna, which Napoleon entered. But the decisive blow would not come in a city. It would come on a frozen field in Moravia. The strategic setup. By late November 1805, Napoleon's army was near the village of Austerlitz. He had around 73,000 men. The Russians under Tsar Alexander I and Austrians under Emperor Francis II gathered nearly 90,000. They were confident. Napoleon appeared weakened and vulnerable. In truth, it was all part of his plan. Napoleon deliberately weakened his right flank, pulling back troops and giving the illusion that he was retreating. He even began peace negotiations to give the appearance of desperation. This deception worked. The Allies believed they could outflank Napoleon and crush his right wing, forcing him into a full retreat. What they didn't realize was that Napoleon wanted them to strike there. The battlefield was chosen for this very trap. The Pratzen Heights, a plateau in the center of the battlefield, was the key to victory. Napoleon had initially vacated it, tempting the Allies to occupy the high ground. But on the day of battle, he planned to retake it with devastating force. December 2nd, 1805, the day of battle. On the morning of December 2nd, a dense fog covered the battlefield. This worked in Napoleon's favor, concealing his troop movements. As the Allies began their attack on the French right, Napoleon waited patiently. At precisely 8 a.m., he gave the order. Marshal Soult's corps was to storm the Pratzen Heights and drive a wedge into the enemy center. The attack was brutal, but perfectly timed. As the Allied center moved downhill to join the attack on Napoleon's right, the heights were momentarily left exposed. Soult's men surged forward, took the high ground, and cut the Allied army in two. Napoleon, observing from a distance, famously declared, "One sharp blow and the war is over." While Soult attacked the center, Marshal Davout's corps marched through the night to reinforce the weak French right, holding it just long enough to complete the trap. The French left, under Lannes and Murat, kept the remaining Allied forces pinned in place. With the Allies divided and demoralized, the battle turned into a rout. The collapse of the coalition forces. By midday on December 2nd, the battlefield near Austerlitz had descended into utter chaos. The once confident Allied forces, Austrian and Russian soldiers who believed they held the advantage, were now fragmented and in full retreat. Napoleon's carefully orchestrated trap had sprung with devastating precision. Entire Allied columns, having been lured into overcommitting to the French right flank, suddenly found themselves cut off from support and encircled. Panic spread like wildfire. Officers shouted contradict. From the high ground of the Pratzen Heights, now firmly in French hands, artillery units rained deadly fire down upon the disoriented enemy. Each cannon blast sent shockwaves across the battlefield, turning open terrain into killing fields. Near the villages of Sokolnitz and Telnitz, fighting devolved into brutal, close-quarter combat. Meanwhile, toward the southern edge of the field, near the frozen lakes of Sachan, hundreds of Allied troops attempted a desperate retreat across the ice. Napoleon ordered. In just a matter of hours, Napoleon had destroyed the might of two great empires. The French captured thousands of prisoners, dozens of artillery pieces, and enemy standards. Estimates put Allied losses at approximately 36,000 men, killed, wounded, or taken prisoner, while the French suffered fewer than 9,000 casualties. The psychological blow was as immense as the physical toll. Tsar Alexander I, witnessing the collapse firsthand, fled the battlefield in humiliation. Emperor Francis II of Austria had no children. The genius behind the victory. So what made Austerlitz not just a victory, but a military masterpiece? It wasn't about brute force or numerical superiority. If anything, Napoleon was slightly outnumbered. The brilliance of Austerlitz lay in the layers of deception, the careful exploitation of terrain, the flawless timing of movements, and the incredible coordination among his corps commanders. Napoleon didn't just fight the enemy, he manipulated them. He allowed them to believe what he wanted them to believe. He weakened his right wing on... The battle was won long before the first shots were fired. Napoleon's psychological warfare began with calculated withdrawals, fake peace overtures, and false intelligence leaks that misled the Allies into thinking the French were in disarray. On the battlefield itself, he allowed the Russians and Austrians to occupy the Pratzen Heights, the key terrain feature, only to lure them downhill into an exposed position. When the Allied center had committed, Napoleon struck with precise force at its heart, using, equally important, was the performance of the Grande Armée. This was not a traditional army of aristocrats and mercenaries. It was a revolutionary force built on ideals of merit, mobility, and national pride. The soldiers were deeply loyal to Napoleon, not just because of his charisma, but because he rewarded talent over title. The core system he implemented allowed for independent yet coordinated action across the battlefield, enabling swift adjustments to the fluid nature of combat. At Austerlitz, the aftermath and legacy of Austerlitz didn't just end a battle or even a war. It redrew the geopolitical map of Europe and cemented Napoleon's position as the supreme military and political power on the continent. In the immediate aftermath of the victory, Napoleon dictated the terms of peace to Austria in the Treaty of Pressburg, stripping the Habsburg Empire of territory, prestige, and influence. But the greater transformation came in 1806, when the Holy Roman Empire, a relic of medieval Europe, was formally dissolved. For the first time in modern history, the political order of Central Europe had been reshaped by one man's battlefield success. Napoleon's newly created Confederation of the Rhine, a league of German client states under French protection, served as a strategic buffer and a symbol of imperial dominance. Austria, humiliated and weakened, was forced to watch its former influence crumble. Russia, though its army remained largely intact, withdrew from the conflict, nursing its wounds and reconsidering its... In France, the victory sparked a wave of national celebration. Napoleon, ever the showman, declared December 2nd, the anniversary of both his coronation and the Battle of Austerlitz, as an imperial holiday. The battle was immortalized in paintings, literature, and public monuments. Artists like Gerard and Gros captured the emperor addressing his troops, while newspapers across the empire hailed him as the new Alexander, the new Caesar. Yet behind the glory, darker forces stirred. Napoleon's ascendancy. Though the Third Coalition had been obliterated, the rest of Europe had not been pacified. Britain, untouched by the battle and secure behind its naval dominance, remained defiantly opposed. In every court across the continent, from Prussia to Portugal, Napoleon's power was admired, feared, and increasingly resented. His dominance forced nations into either submission or secret alliance building. Austerlitz, while a zenith, was also the beginning of a much larger and bloodier struggle. The emperor had shocked. Lessons from Austerlitz. Austerlitz is still studied in military academies around the world. Why? Because it exemplifies the art of turning weakness into strength. Napoleon didn't have more men. He didn't hold the high ground. He didn't even strike first. Instead, he shaped the enemy's perception, controlled the flow of battle, and struck with precision. He turned deception into victory, timing into triumph. It also reminds us that power, when unchecked, invites greater resistance. While Austerlitz elevated Napoleon to new heights, it also set the stage for even greater conflicts. The Napoleonic Wars would continue for another decade, with battles across Spain, Russia, and ultimately Waterloo. But none would surpass Austerlitz in sheer brilliance. Cliffhanger. The long war ahead. As Napoleon's men marched off the battlefield of Austerlitz, the emperor turned to one of his marshals and said, "The sun of Austerlitz has risen." It was more than a boast. It was a symbol of a man at the height of his power, of an army that believed it was unstoppable, and of a Europe that had just witnessed genius at work. But history has a cruel sense of balance. In our next episode, we'll explore how Napoleon's star, burning so brightly at Austerlitz, began to cast longer shadows. From Spain to Moscow, new challenges would rise. The emperor had conquered Europe, but could he hold it?